Meditations on First Philosophy, René Descartes, 1641. Meditation 3. Of God, that He exists. I shall now close my eyes. I shall stop my ears. I shall call away all my senses. I shall efface, even from my thoughts, all the images of corporeal things, or at least I shall esteem them as vain and false. And thus holding converse only with myself and considering my own nature, I shall try little by little to reach a better knowledge of and a more familiar acquaintanceship with myself. I am a thing that thinks, that is to say, that doubts, affirms, denies, that knows a few things, that is ignorant of many, that wills, that desires, that also imagines and perceives. For as I remarked before, although the things which I perceive and imagine are perhaps nothing at all apart from me and in themselves, I am nevertheless assured that these modes of thought that I call perceptions and imaginations, inasmuch only as they are modes of thought, certainly reside in me. And in the little that I have just said, I think I have summed up all that I really know, or at least all that hitherto I was aware that I knew. In order to try to extend my knowledge further, I shall now look around more carefully and see whether I cannot still discover in myself some other things which I have not hitherto perceived. I am certain that I am a thing which thinks, but do I not then likewise know what is requisite to render me certain of a truth? Certainly in this first knowledge there is nothing that assures me of its truth, excepting the clear and distinct perception of that which I state, which would not indeed suffice to assure me that what I say is true, if it could ever happen that a thing which I conceived so clearly and distinctly could be false. And accordingly, it seems to me that already I can establish as a general rule that all things which I perceive very clearly and very distinctly are true. At the same time, I have before received and admitted many things to be very certain and manifest, which yet I afterwards recognized as being dubious. What then were these things? They were the earth, sky, stars, and all other objects, which I apprehended by means of the senses. But what did I clearly perceive in them? Nothing more than the ideas or thoughts of these things were presented to my mind. And not even now do I deny that these ideas are met with in me. But there was yet another thing which I affirmed, and which, owing to the habit which I had formed of believing it, I thought I perceived very clearly, although in truth I did not perceive it at all, to wit, that there were objects outside of me from which these ideas proceeded, and to which they were entirely similar. And it was in this that I erred, or, if perchance my judgment was correct, this was not due to any knowledge arising from my perception. But when I took anything very simple and easy in the sphere of arithmetic or geometry into consideration, e.g., that 2 and 3 together made 5, and other things of the sort, were not these present to my mind so clearly as to enable me to affirm that they were true? Certainly, if I judged that since such matters could be doubted, this would not have been so for any other reason then it came into my mind that perhaps a god might have endowed me with such a nature that I may have been deceived even concerning things which seemed to me most manifest. But every time that this preconceived opinion of the sovereign power of a god presents itself to my thought, I am constrained to confess that it is easy to him, if he wishes it, to cause me to err, even in matters in which I believe myself to have the best evidence. And, on the other hand, always when I direct my attention to things which I believe myself to perceive very clearly, I am so persuaded of their truth that I let myself break out into words such as these: "Let who will deceive me. He can never cause me to be nothing while I think that I am, or some day cause it to be true to say that I have never been, it being true now to say that I am, or that 2 and 3 make more or less than 5, or any such thing in which I see a manifest contradiction. And certainly, since I have no reason to believe that there is a God who is a deceiver, as I have not yet satisfied myself that there is a God at all, the reason for doubt which depends on this opinion alone is very slight, and so to speak metaphysical. But in order to be able altogether to remove it, I must inquire whether there is a God as soon as the occasion presents itself. And if I find that there is a God, I must also inquire whether he may be a deceiver. For without a knowledge of these two truths, I do not see that I can ever be certain of anything. And in order that I may have an opportunity of inquiring into this in an orderly way, it is requisite that I should here divide my thoughts into certain kinds, and that I should consider in which of these kinds there is, properly speaking, truth or error to be found. Of my thoughts, some are, so to speak, images of things, and to these alone is the title idea properly applied. Examples are my thought of a man or of a chimera, of heaven, of an angel, or even of God. But other thoughts possess other forms as well. For example, in willing, fearing, approving, denying, though I always perceive something as the subject of the action of my mind, yet by this action I always add something else to the idea which I have of that thing. And of the thoughts of this kind, some are called volitions or affections, and others judgments. Now, as to what concerns ideas, if we consider them only in themselves, and do not relate them to anything else beyond themselves, they cannot properly speaking be false. For whether I imagine a goat or a chimera, it is not less true that I imagine the one than the other. We must not fear likewise that falsity can enter into will and into affections, for although I may desire evil things, or even things that never existed, it is not the less true that I desire them. Thus there remains no more than the judgments which we make, in which I must take the greatest care not to deceive myself. But the principal error, and the commonest which we may meet with in them, consists in my judging that the ideas which are in me are similar or conformable to the things which are outside me. For without doubt, if I considered the ideas only as certain modes of my thoughts, without trying to relate them to anything beyond, they could scarcely give me material for error. But among these ideas, some appear to me to be innate, some adventitious, and others to be formed by myself. For, as I have the power of understanding what is called a thing, or a truth, or a thought, it appears to me that I hold this power from no other source than my own nature. But if I now hear some sound, if I see the sun, or feel heat, I have hitherto judged that these sensations proceeded from certain things that exist outside of me. And finally, it appears to me that sirens, hippogriffs, and the like are formed out of my own mind. But again, I may possibly persuade myself that all these ideas are of the nature of those which I term adventitious, or else that they are all innate or all fictitious, for I have not yet clearly discovered their true origin. And my principal task in this place is to consider, in respect to those ideas which appear to me to proceed from certain objects that are outside me, what are the reasons which cause me to think them similar to these objects? It seems, indeed, in the first place, that I am taught this lesson by nature, and, secondly, I experience in myself that these ideas do not depend on my will, nor therefore on myself, for they often present themselves to my mind in spite of my will. Just now, for instance, whether I will or whether I do not will, I feel heat, and thus I persuade myself that this feeling, or at least this idea of heat, is produced in me by something which is different from me, i.e., by the heat of the fire near which I sit. And nothing seems to me more obvious than to judge that this object imprints its likeness, rather than anything else, upon me. Now I must discover whether these proofs are sufficiently strong and convincing. When I say that I am so instructed by nature, I merely mean a certain spontaneous inclination which impels me to believe in this connection, and not a natural light which makes me recognize that it is true. But these two things are very different, for I cannot doubt that which the natural light causes me to believe to be true, as, for example, it has shown me that I am from the fact that I doubt, or other facts of the same kind. And I possess no other faculty whereby to distinguish truth from falsehood, which can teach me that what this light shows me to be true is not really true, and no other faculty that is equally trustworthy. But as far as natural impulses are concerned, I have frequently remarked, when I had to make active choice between virtue and vice, that they often enough lead me to the part that was worse, and this is why I do not see any reason for following them in what regards truth and error. And, as to the other reason, which is that these ideas must proceed from objects outside me, since they do not depend on my will, I do not find it any more convincing. For just as these impulses of which I have spoken are found in me, notwithstanding that they do not always concur with my will, so perhaps there is in me some faculty fitted to produce these ideas without the assistance of any external things, even though it is not yet known by me, just as apparently they have hitherto always been found in me during sleep, without the aid of any external objects. And finally, though they did proceed from objects different from myself, it is not a necessary consequence that they should resemble these. On the contrary, I have noticed that in many cases there was a great difference between the object and its idea. I find, for example, two completely diverse ideas of the sun in my mind. The one derives its origin from the senses, and should be placed in the category of adventitious ideas. According to this idea, the sun seems to be extremely small, but the other is derived from astronomical reasonings, i.e., is elicited from certain notions that are innate in me, or else it is formed by me in some other manner. In accordance with it, the sun appears to be several times greater than the earth. These two ideas cannot, indeed, both resemble the same sun, and reason makes me believe that the one which seems to have originated directly from the sun itself is the one which is most dissimilar to it. All this causes me to believe that until the present time, it has not been by a judgment that was certain, but only by a sort of blind impulse that I believed that things existed outside of and different from me, which, by the organs of my senses, or by some other method, whatever it may be, conveyed these ideas or images to me. But there is yet another method of inquiring whether any of the objects of which I have ideas within me exist outside of me. If ideas are only taken as certain modes of thought, I recognize amongst them no difference or inequality, and all appear to proceed from me in the same manner. But when we consider them as images, one representing one thing and the other another, it is clear that they are very different one from the other. There is no doubt that those which represent to me substances are something more, and contain, so to speak, more objective reality within them than those that simply represent modes or accidents. And that idea, again, by which I understand a supreme God, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, and creator of all things which are outside of himself, has certainly more objective reality in itself than those ideas by which finite substances are represented. Now it is manifest by the natural light that there must at least be as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in its effect. For, pray, whence can the effect derive its reality, if not from its cause? And in what way can this cause communicate this reality to it, unless it possessed it in itself? And from this it follows, not only that something cannot proceed from nothing, but likewise that what is more perfect, that is to say, which has more reality within itself, cannot proceed from the less perfect. And this is not only evidently true of those effects which possess actual or formal reality, but also of the ideas in which we consider merely what is termed objective reality. To take an example, the stone which has not yet existed not only cannot now commence to be, unless it has been produced by something which possesses within itself, either formally or immanently, all that enters into the composition of the stone, and heat can only be produced in a subject in which it did not previously exist by a cause that is of an order at least as perfect as heat, and so in all other cases. But further, the idea of heat or of a stone cannot exist in me unless it has been placed within me by some cause which possesses within it at least as much reality as that which I conceive to exist in the heat or the stone. For although this cause does not transmit anything of its actual or formal reality to my idea, we must not for that reason imagine that it is necessarily a less real cause. We must remember that its nature is such that it demands of itself no other formal reality than that which it borrows from my thought, of which it is only a mode. But in order that an idea should contain some one certain objective reality rather than another, it must without doubt derive it from some cause in which there is at least as much formal reality as this idea contains of objective reality. For if we imagine that something is found in an idea which is not found in the cause, it must then have been derived from naught. But however imperfect may be this mode of being by which a thing is objectively in the understanding by its idea, we cannot certainly say that this mode of bearing is nothing, nor consequently that the idea derives its origin from nothing. Nor must I imagine that, since the reality that I consider in these ideas is only objective, it is not essential that this reality should be formally in the causes of my ideas, but that it is sufficient that it should be found objectively. For just as this mode of objective existence pertains to ideas by their proper nature, so does the mode of formal existence pertain to the causes of those ideas by the nature peculiar to them. And although it may be the case that one idea gives birth to another idea, that cannot continue to be so indefinitely. For in the end we must reach an idea whose cause shall, so to speak, be an archetype, in which the whole reality, which is, so to speak, objectively in these ideas, is contained formally. Thus the light of nature causes me to know clearly that the ideas in me are like images, which can, in truth, easily fall short of the perfection of the objects from which they have been derived, but which can never contain anything greater or more perfect. And the longer and the more carefully that I investigate these matters, the more clearly and distinctly do I recognize their truth. But what am I to conclude from it all in the end? It is this, that if the objective reality of any one of my ideas is of such a nature as clearly to make me recognize that it is not in me either formally or immanently, and that consequently I cannot myself be the cause of it, it follows of necessity that I am not alone in the world, but that there is another being which exists, or which is the cause of this idea. On the other hand, had no such an idea existed in me, I should have had no sufficient argument to convince me of the existence of any being beyond myself, for I have made very careful investigation everywhere, and up to the present time have been able to find no other ground. But of my ideas, beyond that which represents me to myself, as to which there can here be no difficulty, there is another which represents a god, and there are others representing corporeal and inanimate things, others angels, others animals, and others again which represent to me men similar to myself. As regards the ideas which represent to me other men or animals, or angels, I can, however, easily conceive that they might be formed by an admixture of the other ideas which I have of myself, of corporeal things, and of God, even although there were apart from me neither men nor animals, nor angels in all the world. And in regard to the ideas of corporeal objects, I do not recognize in them anything so great or so excellent that they might not have possibly proceeded from myself. For if I consider them more closely, and examine them individually, as I yesterday examined the idea of wax, I find that there is very little in them which I perceive clearly and distinctly. Magnitude or extension in length, breadth, or depth, I do so perceive. Also figure, which results from a termination of this extension, the situation which bodies of different figure preserve in relation to one another, and movement or change of situation, to which we may also add substance, duration, and number. As to other things such as light, colors, sounds, scents, tastes, heat, cold, and the other tactile qualities, they are thought by me with so much obscurity and confusion that I do not even know if they are true or false, i.e., whether the ideas which I form of these qualities are actually the ideas of real objects or not. For although I have before remarked that it is only in judgments that falsity, properly speaking, or formal falsity, can be met with, a certain material falsity may nevertheless be found in ideas, i.e., when these ideas represent what is nothing as though it were something. For example, the ideas which I have of cold and heat are so far from clear and distinct that, by their means, I cannot tell whether cold is merely a privation of heat, or heat a privation of cold, or whether both are real qualities, or are not such. And inasmuch as there cannot be any ideas which do not appear to represent some things, if it is correct to say that cold is merely a privation of heat, the idea which represents it to me as something real and positive will not be improperly termed false, and the same holds good of other similar ideas. To these it is certainly not necessary that I should attribute any author other than myself. For if they are false, i.e., if they represent things which do not exist, the light of nature shows me that they issue from naught. That is to say, that they are only in me so far as something is lacking to the perfection of my nature. But if they are true, nevertheless, because they exhibit so little reality to me, that I cannot even clearly distinguish the thing represented from non-being, I do not see any reason why they should not be produced by myself. As to the clear and distinct idea which I have of corporeal things, some of them seem as though I might have derived them from the idea which I possess of myself, as those which I have of substance, duration, number, and such like. For when I think that a stone is a substance, or at least a thing capable of existing of itself, and that I am a substance also, although I conceive that I am a thing that thinks and not one that is extended, and that the stone, on the other hand, is an extended thing which does not think, and that thus there is a notable difference between the two conceptions. They seem, nevertheless, to agree in this, that both represent substances. In the same way, when I perceive that I now exist, and further recollect that I have in former times existed, and when I remember that I have various thoughts of which I can recognize the number, I acquire ideas of duration and number, which I can afterwards transfer to any object that I please. But as to the other qualities of which the ideas of corporeal things are composed, to wit, extension, figure, situation, and motion, it is true that they are not formally in me, since I am only a thing that thinks, but because they are merely certain modes of substance, and because I myself am also a substance, it would seem that they might be contained in me immanently. Hence there remains only the idea of God, concerning which we must consider whether it is something which cannot have proceeded from me myself. By the name God, I understand a substance that is infinite, independent, all-knowing, all-powerful, and by which I myself and everything else, if anything else does exist, have been created. Now all these characteristics are such that the more diligently I attend to them, the less they do appear capable of proceeding from me alone. Hence, from what has been already said, we must conclude that God necessarily exists. For although the idea of substance is within me owing to the fact that I am substance, nevertheless I should not have the idea of an infinite substance, since I am finite, if it had not proceeded from some substance which was veritably infinite. Nor should I imagine that I do not perceive the infinite by a true idea, but only by the negation of the finite, just as I perceive repose and darkness by the negation of movement and of light. For, on the contrary, I see that there is manifestly more reality in infinite substance than in finite, and therefore in some way I have in me the notion of the infinite earlier than the finite, to wit, the notion of God before that of myself. For how would it be possible that I should know that I doubt and desire, that is to say, that something is lacking to me, and that I am not quite perfect, unless I had within me some idea of a being more perfect than myself, in comparison with which I should recognize the deficiencies of my nature? And we cannot say that this idea of God is perhaps materially false, and that consequently I can derive it from naught. As I have just said, it is the case with ideas of heat, cold, and other such things. For on the contrary, as this idea is very clear and distinct, and contains within it more objective reality than any other, there can be none which is of itself more true, nor any in which there can be less suspicion of falsehood. The idea, I say, of this being who is absolutely perfect and infinite is entirely true. For although perhaps we can imagine that such a being does not exist, we cannot nevertheless imagine that his idea represents nothing real to me, as I have said of the idea of cold. This idea is also very clear and distinct, since all that I conceive clearly and distinctly of the real and the true, and of what conveys some perfection, is in its entirety contained in this idea. And this does not cease to be true, although I do not comprehend the infinite, or though in God there is an infinitude of things which I cannot comprehend, nor possibly even reach in any way by thought. For it is of the nature of the infinite that my nature, which is finite and limited, should not comprehend it. And it is sufficient that I should understand this, and that I should judge that all things which I clearly perceive, and in which I know that there is some perfection, and possibly likewise an infinitude of properties of which I am ignorant, are in God formally or eminently, so that the idea which I have of him may become the most true, most clear, and most distinct of all the ideas that are in my mind. But possibly I am something more than I suppose myself to be, and perhaps all those perfections which I attribute to God are in some way potentially in me, although they do not yet disclose themselves or issue in action. As a matter of fact, I am already sensible that my knowledge increases little by little, and I see nothing which can prevent it from increasing more and more into infinitude, nor do I see, after it has thus been increased, anything to prevent my being able to acquire by its means all the other perfections of the divine nature, nor finally why the power I have of acquiring these perfections, if it really exists in me, shall not suffice to produce the ideas of them. At the same time I recognize that this cannot be. For in the first place, although it were true that every day my knowledge acquired new degrees of perfection, and that there were in my nature many things potentially which are not yet there actually, nevertheless these excellences do not pertain to the idea which I have of God, in whom there is nothing merely potential, for it is an infallible token of imperfection in my knowledge that it increases little by little. And further, although my knowledge grows more and more, nevertheless I do not for that reason believe that it can ever be actually infinite, since it can never reach a point so high that it will be unable to attain to any greater increase. But I understand God to be actually infinite, so that he can add nothing to his supreme perfection. And finally, I perceive that the objective being of an idea cannot be produced by a being that exists potentially only, which properly speaking is nothing, but only by a being which is formal or actual. To speak the truth, I see nothing in all that I have just said which by the light of nature is not manifest to anyone who desires to think attentively on the subject. But when I slightly relax my attention, my mind, finding its vision somewhat obscured, and so to speak, blinded by the images of sensible objects, I did not easily recollect the reason why the idea that I possess of a being more perfect than I must necessarily have been placed in me by a being which is really more perfect. And this is why I wish here to go on to inquire whether I, who have this idea, can exist if no such being exists. And I ask, from whom do I then derive my existence? Perhaps from myself or from my parents, or from some other source less perfect than God. For we can imagine nothing more perfect than God, or even as perfect as he is. But were I myself the author of my being, I should doubt nothing, and I should desire nothing, and finally no perfection would be lacking to me, for I should have bestowed on myself every perfection of which I possessed any idea, and should thus be God. And it must not be imagined that those things that are lacking to me are perhaps more difficult of attainment than those which I already possess. For, on the contrary, it is quite evident that it was a matter of much greater difficulty to bring to pass that I, that is to say, a thing or a substance that thinks, should emerge out of nothing, than it would be to attain to the knowledge of many things of which I am ignorant, and which are only the accidents of this thinking substance. But it is clear that if I had of myself possessed this greater perfection of which I have just spoken, I should not at least have denied myself the things which are more easy to acquire, nor should I have deprived myself of any of the things contained in the idea which I form of God, because there are none of them which seem to me specially difficult to acquire. And if there were any that were more difficult to acquire, they would certainly appear to me to be such, supposing I myself were the origin of the other things which I possess, since I should discover in them that my powers were limited. But though I assume that perhaps I have always existed just as I am at present, neither can I escape the force of this reasoning, and imagine that the conclusion to be drawn from this is, that I need not seek for any author of my existence. For all the course of my life may be divided into an infinite number of parts, none of which is in any way dependent on the other, and thus from the fact that I was in existence a short time ago, it does not follow that I must be in existence now, unless some cause at this instance, so to speak, produces me anew, that is to say, conserves me. It is a matter of fact perfectly clear and evident to all those who consider with attention the nature of time, that in order to be conserved in each moment in which it endures, a substance has need of the same power and action as would be necessary to produce and create it anew, supposing it did not yet exist, so that the light of nature shows us clearly that the distinction between creation and conservation is solely a distinction of the reason. All that I thus require here is that I should interrogate myself, if I wish to know whether I possess a power which is capable of bringing it to pass, that I who now am shall still be in the future. For since I am nothing but a thinking thing, or at least since thus far it is only this portion of myself which is precisely in question at present, if such a power did reside in me, I should certainly be conscious of it. But I am conscious of nothing of the kind, and by this I know clearly that I depend on some being different from myself. Possibly, however, this being on which I depend is not that which I call God, and I am created either by my parents or by some other cause less perfect than God. This cannot be because, as I have just said, it is perfectly evident that there must be at least as much reality in the cause as in the effect. And thus, since I am a thinking thing, and possess an idea of God within me, whatever in the end be the cause assigned to my existence, it must be allowed that it is likewise a thinking thing, and that it possesses in itself the idea of all the perfections which I attribute to God. We may again inquire whether this cause derives its origin from itself or from some other thing. For if from itself, it follows by the reasons before brought forward that this cause must itself be God. For since it possesses the virtue of self-existence, it must also, without a doubt, have the power of actually possessing all the perfections of which it has the idea. That is, all those which I conceive as existing in God. But if it derives its existence from some other cause than itself, we shall again ask, for the same reason, whether this second cause exists by itself or through another, until from one step to another we finally arrive at an ultimate cause, which will be God. And it is perfectly manifest that in this there can be no regression into infinity, since what is in question is not so much the cause which formerly created me, as that which conserves me at the present time. Nor can we suppose that several causes may have concurred in my production, and that from one I have received the idea of one of the perfections which I attribute to God, and from another the idea of some other, so that all these perfections indeed exist somewhere in the universe, but not as complete as one unity which is God. On the contrary, the unity, the simplicity or the inseparability of all things which are in God is one of the principal perfections which I conceive to be in him. And certainly the idea of this unity of all divine perfections cannot have been placed in me by any cause from which I have not likewise received the ideas of all the other perfections. For this cause could not make me able to comprehend them as joined together in an inseparable unity, without having at the same time caused me in some measure to know what they are. Finally, so far as my parents are concerned, although all that I have ever been able to believe of them were true, that does not make it follow that it is they who conserve me, nor are they even the authors of my being in any sense, insofar as I am a thinking being, since what they did was merely to implant certain dispositions in that matter in which the self, i.e. the mind, which alone I at present identify with myself, is by me deemed to exist. And thus there can be no difficulty in their regard, but we must of necessity conclude from the fact alone that I exist, or that the idea of a being supremely perfect, that is of God, is in me, and that proof of God's existence is grounded on the highest evidence. It only remains to me to examine into the manner in which I have acquired this idea from God, for I have not received it through the senses, and it is never presented to me unexpectedly, as is usual with the ideas of sensible things, when these things present themselves, or seem to present themselves, to the external organs of my senses. Nor is it likewise a fiction of my mind, for it is not in my power to take from or to add anything to it, and consequently the only alternative is that it is innate in me, just as the idea of myself is innate in me. And one certainly ought not to find it strange that God, in creating me, placed this idea within me, to be like the mark of the workman imprinted on his work. And it is likewise not essential that the mark shall be something different from the work itself. For, from the sole fact that God created me, it is most probable that in some way he has placed his image and similitude upon me, and that I perceive this similitude by means of the same faculty by which I perceive myself. That is to say, when I reflect on myself, I not only know that I am something incomplete and dependent on another, which incessantly aspires after something which is better and greater than myself, but I also know that he on whom I depend possesses in himself all the great things toward which I aspire, and that not indefinitely or potentially alone, but really, actually, and infinitely, and that thus he is God. And the whole strength of the argument which I have here made use of to prove the existence of God consists in this, that I recognize that it is not possible that my nature should be what it is, and indeed that I should have in myself the idea of a God, if God did not veritably exist. A God, I say, whose idea is in me, i.e., who possesses all those supreme perfections of which our mind may indeed have some idea but without understanding them all, who is liable to no errors or defect. From this it is manifest that he cannot be a deceiver, since the light of nature teaches us that fraud and deception necessarily proceed from some defect. But before I examine this matter with more care, and pass on to the consideration of other truths which may be derived from it, it seems to me right to pause for a while in order to contemplate God himself, to ponder at leisure his marvelous attributes, to consider and admire and adore the beauty of this light so resplendent, at least as far as the strength of my mind, which is in some measure dazzled by the sight, will allow me to do so. For just as faith teaches us that the supreme felicity of the other life consists only in this contemplation of the divine majesty, so we continue to learn by experience that a similar meditation, though incomparably less perfect, causes us to enjoy the greatest satisfaction of which we are capable in this life.